So, Natalie, when it comes to food security, what are the enemies? What are the detractors? What are the obstacles or the speed bumps for food security, in your opinion?
There's so many layers that we could look at this at. So I'm going to approach it from more of the philosophical layer to start, and we can drill into that and get really, really specific. But I think the biggest enemy to food security is actually in our minds. It is our perspective about food, where it comes to us from. It's our lack of understanding of our food system in general. I would say that's the number one biggest enemy of food security is a lack of understanding of how the system even works to begin with. For a lot of people, who have gone through living in a community where there are food shortages on a regular basis. So we're talking in areas that are remote, typically northern communities experience this. If you don't ever have that experience of food shortages, you might not understand how food is transported, how far it has to travel, how long it takes for it to get from where it's leaving to where it's coming to. You might not even recognize where your food was produced in the first place. And that ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance in a negative way, but that lack of understanding, it's an enemy to food security because you don't know how fragile it is. Not understanding how fragile our food system is an incredible threat to food security. Now, I've got some others, but before I go to them, I'm really curious to hear off the top of your head, Javan, what's that number one enemy to food security in your mind?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what you've spoken about, and I think what you were speaking about is a symptom of this is that when you live in a land of plenty, the idea of scarcity is so foreign that it becomes romanticized, that it becomes something to watch in a movie, to fantasize about. And through zombie movies and apocalypse stories, it becomes something like, oh, if only we got there, I would be able to, blah, 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 fill in the blank
Yeah.
that your ego wants to put in there, that you'll be amazing. And what happens and how we get there, I think, is when we live in a petroleum culture that is based upon the incredible energy that's in a liter, a gallon of gasoline, of oil. We forget that before enlightenment, we cut wood and carry water. And after enlightenment, we cut wood and carry water. And so the majority of us, kicking back to you a bit, we've never had hard times. We've never been in a situation where it takes a little bit of effort to get what we want, to the point to where it takes 5 minutes more to get to where we're going, and we're disturbed. Our peace is disturbed. We are frustrated. We have a lack of ease that comes with that. And so never living in a place where there's been hardship. And this goes back to, I think we've had this conversation where there's an amazing Vietnamese man that came to America, and he was asked, what's better, living in America or living in Vietnam? He said, it's different. And they said, well, how? And he goes, in America, it's easy choices, and thus it's a hard life because there's nothing really to guide you. And yet in Vietnam, it was hard choices. So it was an easy life. When you work for something, there's value to it. When you work for a moment, there's value to it. And I know you and I know this because when you work for all your carrots, when you work for all your potatoes, when you guard them against others who would love to eat them that are not necessarily your family, and they finally make it into storage, there's a massive amount of satisfaction. And it's just not the same when you go and purchase food from the grocery store or from a restaurant or anything else. I think we've supplanted a lot of that self-satisfaction with like, oh, look at this great place I found. And, oh, isn't it great? Like, aren't I great for giving you a recommendation that anyone could give us to go to a new restaurant? And yes, it's lovely and all the rest of it, but there is a satisfaction when you've made food or when somebody else has made food and you know that they've grown it or they've raised it and they've harvested and they've preserved it, or they've, created beautiful prosciutto out of deer or duck, or, all of these pieces, and they hand it to you. You know that this was hours of somebody's labor. This wasn't factory made. This wasn't a balance sheet food. This was food that was created by hands. And so I think for me, the enemy is entitlement created by a life in a land of plenty, to the point to where we don't think a problem could ever happen.
Yeah, that's a big one for sure. I think this next one for me, it kind of builds off of that, is that we have this system because we've had so much bounty for so long. And these things are, scarcity is not a part of our direct experience. And it's out of sight, out of mind. Our food system is out of sight, out of mind. You don't ever really get an opportunity to watch what butchering a lamb looks like because it's out of sight, out of mind. That's happening somewhere far, far away. And, you don't ever get to welcome piglets into the world. You don't watch carrots sprout, those tiny, tiny little leaves that first come out of the ground, and patiently wait for them because it's all out of sight, out of mind, until those very last steps of reaping the reward of making the food. That's the very last step. Eating food, preparing food is the last step in a season to multi-year long process for our food. And we only ever see that last maybe 2% of that process. And because it's all out of sight, out of mind, it goes back to what I was saying before. We have no understanding of it. We don't even know what it took to raise those animals. We don't know what it takes to get an egg or to produce a cabbage. And let me tell you, cabbage ain't the easiest thing to grow. There's so much that wants to eat cabbages. So because it's out of sight, out of mind, we never see it. We never participate in it. And when I say we, I just mean society at large. We are woefully ignorant of how precious it is that this bounty that we have, the results of this multi-generation lifestyle when it comes to food, and that entitlement that we want T-bone steak. We don't want brisket. We don't want those non-choice cuts. We don't want to eat liver and heart and tongue, which to me are the best parts, but nobody wants to eat them because we don't understand how much it takes or how few T-bones actually come off of an animal. It's not very many. And so this ignorance, it presents incredible challenges if we want to actually have food security.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something there where hasn't been a lack of lack in terms of our generation or our lifespan. We're seeing it a little bit, I think, with some of the global health conversations and some of the quote unquote natural disasters. Of course, they're only natural disasters when they happen to humans. Before us, they were just ecological and biological and geological and meteorological functionality. But when you get to that place where there's no lack of lack, you've never been hungry, you've never gone without water, you've never gone without heat or power, you've never gone without food. It's very hard for people to see in their mind's eye what that looks like and thus have motivation to go out and do something about it, to do something about their food security or their food sovereignty. And without that lack, there's a problem. When folks are listening to this and going, okay, interesting, that's an interesting conversation. As I'm thinking about questions folks could take away, it's kind of hard to say, where am I blind when it comes to my food security? That's a hard question to ask. And so I think something that might be a little bit more useful is take your favorite food and trace where it comes from before you look, before you search it online, before you Google it. Really ask yourself, where does this food come from? And what are all the steps to get it here? And do I know experientially, not do I cognitively know? Did I watch something? Did I hear something? But do I experientially know and have visceral muscle memory of how to produce that food for myself? And I think that question, I know that's a question that I came to years ago, was illuminating to the point of deeply depressing, because I didn't know the majority of how this food was produced. Yeah, okay, you put a seed in the ground and it comes out. I'd never done that. Oh yeah, this lamb is raised, but I'd never raised a lamb. And when you look down the line of all those foods, you come up with a pretty large deficiency in terms of actual experiential knowledge. For you, what are some questions that you'd want people to think about when it comes to surmounting the enemies or understanding the enemies of food security?
I think it's really important, when you're talking about understanding our own blind spots, it's really important to understand that it's going to be context specific for everyone. And so I would encourage people to ask, well, what is my food context? What has my life been? When we're talking about that, we don't experience lack. And so that's one of the big barriers that we're having to fully understanding food security. I'd say some people have had lack. Some people do go hungry, even in my community every day. However, the biggest difference now versus a few generations ago is that a few generations ago, there was the knowledge of how to produce the food. And so when there was an environmental disaster, like you said, there's drought for multi-years, people understood how to produce the food security, but sometimes factors prevent that. Whereas today, we might have people going hungry without the knowledge of how to produce that food security, where to go and gather food. And so I would say we have different contexts in terms of what's causing food security. And the question that I would challenge people to ask is, what is my context when it comes to my blind spots? How was I raised around food? What generation was I raised by? My mother's generation had also never really gone hungry. And so we gardened a bit, but it wasn't a big deal. One generation prior to that, though, oh goodness, they knew how to garden because they had experienced loss of jobs. They lived through the Depression. And so they had experienced economic turmoil to a degree that you needed to grow food or you starved. And so asking myself, well, who was I raised by? What's the context of my experiences around food growing up? And how does that shape how I see food? I was raised by a blue collar family where my father went to work. He worked doing steel work and sheet metal work. And so, we've got this grocery shopping every certain period of time. That's food security in that context. So food security then is having an income to go buy food, because the assumption is that it's always going to be at the grocery store. And you know what? Growing up, it always was at the grocery store. So that's my context. Somebody in a northern community has a very different context, because you know what? Growing up, there were days when there was no food at the grocery store. So knowing where we're starting from and what that context is for us, that really gives us a leg up to know, okay, I have this background that I was raised with in regards to food. And now looking forward from that place that I come from, what do I need to focus on to build food? Because you know what? Maybe I grew up hunting in the bush. I already know how to do that, but I don't know how to grow food. So looking back to where we come from, it helps identify those paths that we are going forward to in building our food security and food sovereignty.
Wonderful. It's so important to bring in context. It's so important to acknowledge and even to inquire back into our context. Sometimes we don't think about it and we don't actually know it. So I love that you've brought up that question. If this type of conversation is of interest to you, if you're somebody who's thinking about food and thinking about plenty and thinking about lack, you might really appreciate a program that Natalie and I are offering called Family Food Security. It's a 12-session, 7-month program where we walk you through step by step, understanding how much does my family eat, of what types of food, and then producing a poundage and an item list of how much that is, and then walking through your process of how to decide how to access, gather, store, grow, forage, purchase that food step by step. We walk alongside you, coaching you along the way to the point to where by the end of those 7 months, you've improved your family food security and hopefully even increased your family food sovereignty. If you're one of those people that loves to do it yourself, we also have a do-it-yourself option, which is a great way for those folks that just want to jump in and they've got that kind of motivation. If that's of interest to you, check out regenerativeliving.online/family food security, and we'll see you in the next conversation all about food.